the role of the Christian church is to see the divine image of God in the face of all who come to you. Now I have to say, perhaps this is a little confession time, that there have been times where I've wanted to use the passages from Paul to my own advantage. Let me tell you one experience when I was coming back from a cruise one summer. I was down in Mexico on one of those four-day cruises that you get, just down from Long Beach. And I was coming back on the cruise, and I'm not a citizen of the United States, and so I still have my British passport. And I was coming back. It was very early in the morning. Any of you have ever been on one of those cruises? You get up at 5 o'clock, and if you're international, you have to get up at 3 o'clock to be processed. And so I'm there in just my jogging bottoms and a sloppy top, and I'm being processed by, please don't get an image. And I'm just being processed. I'm being processed by the immigration officer, who happens to be a woman. And she said, what's your business in the United States of America? And I said, well, I'm a pastor of a church. And she looked at me and she said, you don't look like a pastor. It's early in the morning. I've not done my hair, my nails aren't done. My first question in my head was, well, what does a minister look like? What does a pastor look like? I hadn't quite got that, Perhaps I should be 30 years older, or perhaps I should have less hair. I don't know what it was that she was expecting of me. And so I said, well, I'm the pastor of the Metropolitan Community Church of Los Angeles. She said, recite scripture to me. It's 7 o'clock in the morning. So I started off, I said, John 3:16, for God so loved the world that God. She said, stop. Everybody knows that scripture. Friends, at that moment, I so wanted to quote the Apostle Paul. Women should keep silent and have no authority over men. See, even preachers can be a little devilish at times. Managed to find one other scripture, 1 Corinthians 13. And eventually she stamped my passport and I was let back into the country. Sexism is alive and well. And sexism is just not attributed to heterosexual men. Sexism is attributed to our community too. To the community that we are, the people of God that we have been called to be. You see, the reality is that most of us, whether we self-identify as homosexual or not, especially those of us who are men, were brought up in a system where we were still taught that men were better than women. Yes. And that men were superior to women. And there is still, I think, in all of our psyche, especially those of us who are men, still have that fundamental understanding that no matter how much we try to eradicate that from our lives, no matter how much we have been persecuted in our own experience, somehow there's something about our psyche that we still like to have power over another group, another section of society. And even in metropolitan community churches, we've had to grapple with sexism in our churches and in our communities. We've had to deal with issues around inclusive language and how do we ensure that our language includes as many people at the table. And that's not just talking about brothers and sisters, and instead of calling God he, we say God or creator or spirit or some other language that helps us to include or to reframe our theology or to really come back to the basics of our theology that says that God, nowhere in Scripture says that God was a man. And so why do we continue that oppression? We've had to deal with issues around inclusive language. We've had to deal with issues around how we include more people at the table. And still in some of our metropolitan community churches, there is still an inequality between that which we pay our male clergy and that which we pay our female clergy, who are senior pastors of congregations. We somehow still think that it's okay to pay a woman less than it is okay to pay a man. You see, we're not clean in this whole sacred conversation around sexism. And sisters and brothers, we need to own up to our own experience. We need to own up to our own prejudices. We need to own up in our own communities in order for us to heal those issues that are happening right here, right now in our church. And they've been heightened because of some of the stuff that's been going on, but we must raise our consciousness. For the only way to truly heal this world is to bring that consciousness out, allow it to be made manifest, and then to heal it in the world today. Sexism, the way we treat women. I have to confess that even in my own experience, and I try not to use that sexism of the heterosexual world, but I know I use the sexism that happens in our homosexual world, in our gay world. I can't help but think back to the AIDS pandemic in our world, and to think about how those of us who are gay men and who are living with HIV and AIDS so counted on our women. So counted on our women to staff phone lines. How we counted on our women to be at our bedsides when we were ill. How we counted on our women to do things that perhaps we'd never engaged our women in our lives in the past. And now in our 21st century, how even in our community, we still segregate our women and our men. And we keep them apart. Well, I want to be honest with you, it's only since we've moved here to Los Feliz that the attendance of women in our congregation has been at the highest that I think we ever did when we were in West Hollywood. And I want to thank God for that, because I think that this makes for a much healthier experience and a much healthier experience of church. And of course, that says nothing about our transgendered folk and our bisexual folk and the heterosexual folk who have begun to join us and to become part of this community. I want to thank God for our heterosexuals in this congregation. And all of the varieties of peoples that have begun to be seen amongst us. So it's really important, if we truly are committed to growing a church that really represents the face of God, and I think that the face of God looks like every single one of us. If we're truly committed to that, these sacred conversations about what Paul says versus what Jesus lived is very important for us. Jesus' theology, in the scripture reading this morning from the gospel, teaches us how Jesus was transformed in his own theology by a woman. And it wasn't just any woman. This was a woman who was considered outside of the chosen race, outside of the chosen ones of Israel. This woman comes to Jesus. Oh, she had some audacity. She'd heard about this Jesus. She knew that he had something that she could get. And, remembering, of course, women were second class, they were outsiders, they weren't welcome, came to Jesus and said, I hear you can heal my daughter. And Jesus is a little dismissive of her. I think Jesus, in his own attitude, was experiencing his own level of sexism in his own body. Perhaps he was a little frightened about speaking to somebody outside. Perhaps he was a little nervous. Perhaps he just bought into that whole thing that it really was just about the chosen one and about men.